Well, we were just talking about the fact that with the end of World War II, the immense popularity of the comic book superhero started to fade, and it started to fade fairly quickly. And I had asked the question, well, what's going to be the in thing now? Well, there's several genres that would sort of take turns being the in thing in the late 40s and early 50s. There's the teen life genre, the Western genre, the crime genre, horror, and romance. Now, other than romance, all the other genres had been in existence already during the war, since at least the early 40s, if not in some cases the very beginning of comic books. Remember Marvel Comics #1, one of the features was a Western story. Well, I mentioned that romance is an exception. The first romance comic was called Young Romance, and it came out in 1947, and it was the brainchild and creation of Joe Simon and Jack Kirby. Yes, Simon and Kirby created Captain America, and they also created romance comics. Now, what's the difference between romance comics and teen life comics, which often have a strong element of romance? Well, in the teen life thing, which we're going to look at a little more closely here in a second, it's not played seriously. It's kind of for laughs, and it has a lot to do with, it's almost like situation comedy or romantic comedy. Whereas these romance comics were very serious, at least they presented themselves so. They were kind of torrid, you might say. All right, well, Young Romance came out in 1947. Also in 1947, Eerie comics came out. Now, I really should have, I should clarify what I said. Horror kind of sort of existed. There was the Heap, and you could say the Heap in a way was a horror backup strip. But there were no titles. There were no comic book titles devoted to horror until Eerie Comics in 1947, which had about 6 stories, one of which was illustrated by Joe Kubert that we'll be talking a lot about later on in this course. But it was a one-shot. It was a little bit ahead of the Wave. The Wave would start hitting a couple of years later, 2 or 3 years later. Eerie Comics would be resurrected as a monthly title in 1951 and run for a year or two. Crime, of course, we had looked at the very first crime comic earlier when we were talking about Lev Gleason Productions and Charles Biro. Crime Does Not Pay. Well, crime might not pay, but writing about it was starting to finally pay for Lev Gleason Productions in the late 40s. In fact, by 1948, which was the height of the crime wave, you might say, Crime Does Not Pay was selling 1.5 million copies an issue. Now, stop for a moment and think about that. That's more than Superman or Captain Marvel at their height. And Crime Does Not Pay, which was way ahead of the curve, came out in the early 40s, by 47, 48 was one of only 38 crime titles, which altogether accounted for about 15% of the comic book market. And the way these stories would work is that, just as this title implies, Crime Does Not Pay, you got the vicious, violent criminals doing these lurid things, and in the end, they always get theirs, one way or another. And so it's kind of presented, especially Lev Gleason books, were kind of presented as a public service for kids, kind of like a Scared Straight kind of thing. Here's how you'll end up. But then again, it was also very exciting, very sensationalized, and right up to the last panel when they got their just desserts, they were living it up. Well, 1949, Lev Gleason Publications had a little experiment, again with Charles Bureau in charge of the artwork. He didn't do all the artwork, but he was the art director. A new magazine called Tops, the adult magazine of dramatic picture stories. A lot of these stories were very much crime stories. Others were, maybe not necessarily crime stories, but on the lurid side or the adult side, such as Marriage Swap Shop and Summer Waitress. When I said this was an experiment, the experiment was the format. This was not a standard-sized comic book. It was 10 1/4 inches by 13 1/4 inches, so it's giant. So it was the size of Life magazine, which may not mean anything to some of you listening, but it's like a really big magazine, not so far as thick, but just like, the size of the magazine. And what that means is these were not sold on the comic book spinner racks or with the other comics. They were sold with the regular magazines. In fact, they were placed right next to Life magazine because they are adult in content, being adult, explicitly stating that they're adult and not being with the regular comic books, sort of gave them the opportunity to push the envelope even further than they already were. Here's an example of some of Bureau's artwork. Now, some of this is from the regular crime comics, like the one on the top right. But some of this is also from Tops. You see, a lady getting her brains bashed out by a telephone, torture with some kind of a burning iron, stuff like that. This sort of thing will become more common in regular comics right after this, but in the horror rather than the crime per se. However, the experiment didn't work very well. And that's because the book never found an audience. Because people that were looking through the magazine section, the people who were drawn to, for example, Life magazine or Time magazine, didn't necessarily want to read a comic book. And the people that wanted to read a comic book, even adults looking for crime comics, would not think to look for it over by Life magazine, right? So their sales were horrible, and it only lasted 2 issues. Now, later on in the course, we're going to go back and look specifically at several different genres and trace them over time, including westerns and horror and crime and science fiction and war. So I'm not going to go into more detail about those right now, but I am going to go into more detail about the teen life aspect, because that's one that, although it's been long-lasting and still exists, hasn't been as broad, I guess. You'll see what I mean as we get to it. Anyway, the teen life thing, I kind of talked about the difference between that and romance, despite the fact there's romance involved in both. Maybe you've seen the Andy Hardy movies from the 1930s and 40s. Again, depending on which students are watching these lectures, you may have never even heard of them. Some of you may have, you've heard of the 1930s anyway. So anyway, there was a very popular series of films starting in 1937. It ran for almost a decade, 16 movies in that period, about the adventures of Andy Hardy, played by Mickey Rooney, many of them co-starring Judy Garland, who's most famous for being an outstanding singer and for being in The Wizard of Oz. But these films were very popular, and they're kind of the template that the teen life thing would be built on in comics starting in the early 40s. And the template is basically, it's very much geared toward humor, maybe not slapstick humor, but situational humor, situation comedy. And despite the fact that there's the romantic angle with teenagers trying to pursue one another, that also is not presented as an extremely serious thing, because these movies are made by grown-ups, right? So it's almost kind of condescending in a way, and presented as kind of silly. So another reason that I wanted to talk about the teen life thing is because this particular example we're going to look at perfectly sums up the transition from superheroes to something else. So we're going to go back to the early 40s. We're going to look at Pep Comics by MLJ. MLJ introduced The Shield in Pep Comics #1 in 1940. He was about a year ahead of Captain America, remember, as the first flag-draped superhero. Later, the Hangman came along. There he is. Issue 22 of Pep Comics in December of 1941, I believe it was, featured the first appearance of Archie Andrews, there at Riverdale High with his various friends, having teenage misadventures. It was a backup story. It was one of several, which was kind of the common way of doing things, right? These comics at the time, most of them were anthology comics. So there wasn't just one story that took up the whole book. So there was the lead story that was on the cover, and then there were other ones. Well, Archie Andrews is there buried in the back pages in 1941 and continues to be so for the next couple of years. Then he starts showing up over on the side along with some of the other also starring things. But by 1944, as you can see, here's an example. This is from June of 1944. Archie had become the cover story in Pep Comics, and he had been for several months at this time, as the superhero thing was becoming less popular. The Shield still appeared on the cover, but in the background, interacting with the Archie gang, until December of 1944, when the Shield is there with the also starrings rather than right there and on the main picture. And that's the last time the Shield ever appeared on the cover of the comics. Now, he would continue appearing, but now he's the backup story until issue 65. So that would have been 1946 or so, in which case he just kind of faded away and disappeared. So here, issue 50, there he is, the Shield as also starring. Issue 51, December of 44, he's not on there at all. More changes were coming in 1946 is when the changes came. So here is an issue of Pep Comics starring Archie from December 1945, 4 months after the war ended. But usually the cover date was 2 to 3 months ahead of when it was actually published. The idea being that the comics could stay on the stands for up to a couple of months before they were out of date, right? So this is really probably September, October 1945, literally a month or so after World War II ended. Can you see the difference between the December issue and the January issue the next month, which also happens to be the next year, January 1946. Well, there's one difference that you can't see on the cover unless you were paying really close attention in the previous slide, and that is the fact that with the transition from 1945 to 46, the comic went from being published quarterly, once every 3 months, to being published monthly. Now, that only happens when a book has gained popularity, okay? But that's not the difference we're looking for. The difference we can see on the cover is, of course, the fact that in the December issue on the left, down in the lower left-hand corner, we are informed it is an MLJ magazine, because that's the name of the company. The next month, that's not on there, and it's never on there again, nor is it on any of the other books the company puts out. But it is still the same company. However, we're informed here this is an Archie magazine. MLJ, because Archie was so popular, MLJ changed the name of their company and legally changed it to Archie Comics. As you can see on the left, this one I think it's from 1953, Archie, America's Top Teenager. He also got a second title called Archie, which identified him as America's typical teenager. Now, the basic format of the Archie comics remained pretty much unchanged down through the decades. The formula remained the same. It was geared toward humor, it's like a high school sitcom, basically. It's kind of like Saved by the Bell. That's what it was. The art changed a little bit between the 40s and the early 60s. You could look there from the one from 1953 on the left and look at the one from 1963 on the right, and you can see that Archie's lost a little weight and got his teeth fixed. So that big kind of buck-tooth look that he'd had all through the 40s into the early 50s, that was gone. And the basic look of the characters by the early 60s is the look they were going to have for a very long time afterward. In fact, as the years went by and as history marched on and the world changed around Archie, Riverdale didn't change that much. Now you can see here 1975, this issue, Archie, Betty, Veronica, Reggie all look about the same as they always have, but they got bell bottoms on. And some of the people they're running into, some of the teenagers have longer hair. Then here in 1987, again you see that Archie and Jughead and Veronica all look about pretty much the same, except the other teenage girl with them has got big hair, like it's the 80s, right? By the way, the issue here on the right, number 411, that's from 1987, that was the final issue of Pep Comics. So managed to hang in there for 47 years. But it was not the end of Archie. It was a sign the popularity of Archie was in decline in the 80s. And indeed it was. For a lot of readers, comic books had become a more serious pursuit. In fact, 1987, as we'll see later, that's the year that the dark and gritty really came to the comics. And Archie was just not dark and gritty. So Pep fell by the wayside. But Archie Comics was still around and still pretty much unchanged. In fact, here's the Archie titles from 2005. Other than, well, you can't really even tell many style differences. Other than this issue of Veronica where she's hanging out with a couple of twins that have a soul patch. That's the only thing that you can tell different between then and 1960, other than the fact that they now have black friends. That's a big difference. So, again, as the years went by, Archie had followed the same basic theme without much change, except now for about 30 years, from the late 50s up until, let's see, the late 50s, from the mid 50s up until 1983, there was another title, Little Archie, which was about the same gang, like, when they were in elementary school. Now notice this one also fell by the wayside in the 80s. In fact, the timeless innocence of the teenage world of Archie lent itself to satire, lent itself easily to satire. And usually the satire involved the implication that teenagers are not that timelessly innocent. So in the June 1954 issue of Mad, which was issue 12, Mad was a comic book at that time and in color, this story by Harvey Kurtzman, the writer, and Will Elder, the artist, who signed his name Bill Elder at this time. This story about Starchy, as it says in the table of contents, the typical story of typical America's most hated typical teenager, typical page 1. And hopefully you're familiar with Mad Magazine, which would lampoon various things, right? They would change the names. So Archie becomes Starchy. Jughead, Archie's best friend, becomes Bottleneck. Betty and Veronica become Biddy and Salonica. So on the first page here, you've got, here we are at Riverdale High, and two other comic strip characters are there, Blondie and Little Orphan Annie. Blondie says, uh-oh, there goes that typical teenager Starchy with his typical teenager friend Bottleneck into Mr. Weathernot's office. I wonder what they did this time. Little Orphan Annie says, probably did some typical teenage cheating on the exams. That Starchy would be cute if only he changed his clothes once in a while. He's been wearing that same outfit for years. Well, Starchy and Bottleneck, alias Archie and Jughead, go into the principal's office, Mr. Weathernot in Mad, Mr. Weatherby in the comics, and discover that in the Mad world, the principal is a perverted old sex fiend who is chasing the teenage girls around. This was way pre-Me Too. Then later in the story, we have Starchy blowing smoke in Salonica's face and trying to convince her to cut class with him to go drink whiskey. And then, he and Bottleneck conspire to raise some money by selling some school passes. So, again, the joke here is this is not what you expect from Archie, according to the comic books. Now, this is one thing. But there was another satire the following decade that caused some problems, and it was by the same people, Harvey Kurtzman and Will Elder. They were no longer working at Mad. They were now working at a magazine called Help! Published by Jack Warren. Warren Publications in the 1960s and 70s was very well known for their black and white comic magazines, following the lead of Mad eventually by going to a black and white magazine rather than a comic book, because then they could be sold with the regular magazines. That's kind of what Top had planned. So Help, which lasted for about 5 years, from 60 to 65, I think. Help was intended to be sort of a cross between Mad Magazine and Playboy. Playboy, of course, we've talked about in here before. Jack Cole, creator of Plastic Man, was a cartoonist for Playboy. They had a lot of cartoons and comic strips. So Help had some nudity, and it had some satirical pieces. Well, there was a character that Kurtzman and Elder had created for Help to be sort of like the mascot of the magazine, named Goodman Beaver. And each issue, Goodman Beaver would encounter some famous person. Well, in this one, It's entitled Goodman Goes Playboy, and this is from, I think, the February 1962 issue of Help. So it turns out that Goodman Beaver is a graduate of Riverdale High, and he's going back for the 5-year reunion to meet up with his old friends, Archie and the gang. Well, as the dialogue shows, Archie and the gang have changed significantly. The idea of the strip here is that America's youth has been influenced by Hugh Hefner and Playboy, and are trying to be more urbane. Right here they are talking about champagne and stuff like that, and more adult music and literature, becoming more urbane and also becoming more libertine as a Playboy would. And as you can see, as the dialogue continues, there's a lot of talk about their sports cars and about places to go in France. And Reggie is smoking a pipe a la Hugh Hefner. Well, you know, what's so bad about all that? The fact is that Archie Comics got really upset about this parody as compared to the Mad parody. I can't, well, I guess I could, but I'm not going to show you the following pages. But suffice it to say that, you know, maybe there's some drinking and driving. Maybe Jughead finds out he got Betty pregnant. Maybe there's a life-sized sex doll. Maybe there's a several-page-long mass orgy. And maybe Goodman Beaver finds out that Archie has this lifestyle because he has sold his soul to Satan, who is incarnated in the guise of Hugh Hefner. I will show you the final image after Archie's friends learn that he took that deal, and that's why he has all this wine and women. They all line up to make the same deal, and then all these other comic strip characters show up to make that deal too. Well, like I said, Archie Comics were a little bit upset about this because they felt this went beyond mere satire and damaged their brand being timeless innocence of teenagedom, right? And so they won, and Jack Warren had to pay them a lot of money and promise not to reprint that story. Although, thanks to the passage of almost 60 years, and the wonders of the internet age, you can find it and read the whole thing online. But eventually, in the pages of Archie Comics, Archie and the gang did change, and that happened in 2007. It happened because sales had been consistently slipping for some time because Archie was a relic of the past. He was really a relic of the 1940s, and modern kids just couldn't identify with Archie. So the company decided to introduce a new look, a more modern look to the characters, beginning in 2007, and as well to have somewhat more serious storylines. Then another change was made in 2015 when the modernized look was brought even closer and the stories got even more serious, and it became the stories became serialized as opposed to little 6-page stories. It was one ongoing, kind of like a teenage soap opera, really. It had turned, and again, some of you may be too young to get this reference, but it had turned from Saved by the Bell to Beverly Hills 90210 in a sense. But when it did, sales picked up considerably. And the storyline, Mark Waid being one of the people who was responsible for doing the writing, the storylines and the artwork started to receive critical recognition, which is something Archie had never done before. Well, part of the reason, perhaps, for making this change in 2015, and by the way, the change included taking all the titles and starting them over at issue 1, just like starting over from scratch. Part of the reason for this may have been that Archie, the company, was already laying plans to make a television pilot, something that would be more like Beverly Hills 90210, I guess. And in 2017, that show debuted. It's called Riverdale. It has recently concluded its 4th season, proven to be very popular, and I have no doubt that there are high school students and college students that maybe watch this show that have never even heard of an Archie comic book and have no idea that this comes from the comics. And if they do, they associate it with the more modernized comics, which it's been years now that's been in vogue, and not that 1940s and 50s personification. I also wouldn't be surprised if most of the younger people watching the show and enjoying the show on the CW don't know that this isn't the first Archie series. It is the first live action. Well, actually, it's not even that. I think there was a special live action back in the 70s. But there was an animated series that started in 1968. In fact, that's one of my earliest memories is watching that show. I was born in 1968, and it ran in various incarnations for about 10 years. The Archies, or the Archie Show. And also, a big sort of cultural impact that the cartoon show had was that, quote, the Archies, which was the band that the gang put together, studio musicians were hired to actually put together albums to release as the Archies. And one of those albums had a single that became the #1 song in America in 1969.
And now, the Riverdale Carnival presents the Archies.
Take care of the kissing booth while we're singing, Sabrina.
Okay, everybody, here we go with our new hit record, Sugar, Sugar!
Apparently, Archie has a much better singing voice than a speaking voice. I'm just saying. Due to its success, Archie had a lot of imitators in the mid-1940s. Same way Superman had a lot of imitators after his success in '38. But really, the only ones with any real staying power were both from Timely Comics, which in the early 50s, of course, became Atlas Comics. Millie the Model, which debuted in 1945 and would last all the way up to 1973. And Patsy Walker, who debuted in 1944 as a backup feature in Miss America, the superhero comic, and got her own title in 1944 or 45, and that one lasted till 1967. What that means is that in the 60s, when Marvel was putting out the X-Men and the Fantastic Four, and Iron Man and all this stuff, they were also still doing Millie the Model and Patsy Walker. But Patsy Walker wasn't gone for too long. In fact, 5 years after her magazine was canceled in 1972, she showed up in an adventure of the Beast, an Amazing Adventures. And the implication was that she was on the road to becoming a superhero. And in 1976, she debuted as Hellcat, a member of the Avengers, which she was for just a short time. Then she spent many years, actually, as a regular member of the Defenders. And speaking of the Defenders, if you are familiar at all with the Netflix Marvel superhero series of the past several years that were all part of the overall Defenders umbrella, then you've seen Patsy Walker there too. Except you've seen her as Trish Walker, the best friend of Jessica Jones, who in the storyline was known as Patsy Walker when she was a child actress and has gone, Patricia, Patsy, Trish. And over the course of that series, in the 3rd season, she also gets superpowers and even briefly puts on the traditional comic book outfit.